Okay, so we hugely privileged to have the next hour, and I think everyone watching will agree that John's national contribution to the theatre has been more than considerable. I'll keep the introduction very short because we've got a lot to talk about. Everyone knows he's a great actor, director, producer, writer, founder of the Bell Shakespeare Company, leading authority on interpreting, directing, performing Shakespeare, and amongst many other things, he's the author of an excellent book on Shakespeare, which I can strongly recommend. This was published in 2011. I had the great privilege of interviewing John in 2012 and asking him a few things about Shakespeare in general, and then more specifically about Shakespeare's great play, The Merchant of Venice, which quite remarkably Shakespeare wrote when he was only 31 years old. So, one of the things about Shakespeare, of course, is that he is universally relevant, and the play is particularly relevant today. Written, I think, 425 years ago, it deals with relevant issues we face: the resurgence of xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, with the decadence of the wealthy and the privileged, and the unscrupulous pursuit of money, political power and corruption, of, in some cases, sort of reclassifying citizens as aliens. But is a great playwright, and as such, he doesn't try to be didactic or to preach, but his exploration of universal issues makes him forever relevant. So Shakespeare's contemporary, Ben Jonson, and I think John refers to this in his book, famously says, he was not of an age quoted right on every year. John Hughes wrote another one, and the reasons why. So perhaps you can just, as an adolescent, and then, why have you devoted most of your professional life to his work?
Well, that's a big question, Milton, but just put it very briefly. I remember when I first heard Shakespeare, it was on the ABC radio. They used to play Shakespeare plays and other classics quite regularly, along with dance band music and the news and naturalist programs, all sorts of democratic mixed bag of programs. But I remember sitting one night and hearing Ron Hadrick performing Brutus and Julius Caesar, and my hair stood on end. I'd never heard language like that. I was so amazed by the language. And then at school, I was very fortunate, unlike many people, to have two wonderful teachers who loved Shakespeare and theatre and poetry, etc. And they introduced me to, we studied 6 Shakespeare plays in my high school days.
In Maitland?
In Maitland. 6 plays in great detail, so we knew them almost by heart. And they encouraged me to perform in them. And my second teacher said, "You're going to be an actor when you finish school," and that's it. I've sealed your fate. And that's all I wanted to do since I was about 15. I wanted to be an actor, and particularly speaking Shakespeare.
I see. So, people comment that not much is known about Shakespeare, the man, but in your book, you develop an interesting portrait of him. What kind of man do you think he was? Give us a bit of a character sketch of him, and, what makes his talents so unique for you?
I think when people say we don't know much about Shakespeare, I think we know everything about him, everything he ever thought or felt or saw or heard or loved or hated. It's all there. The hard part is deciding which is Shakespeare talking and which one is the character. Immersed himself so deeply in the characters, you can't really ever surely say, well, he believed that, or he felt that, or he thought that. It's almost somebody else talking. And so it's easy to construct your own Shakespeare. You can argue that he was a good, devout Catholic, or a stern Protestant, or an atheist, or agnostic. He was heterosexual, he was conservative, he was radical. You can really pick and choose by quoting what you want Shakespeare to be for you. We know that he was born into a good middle-class family. His father was a successful businessman, the mayor of Stratford at one stage, or the equivalent of. So Shakespeare went to the local grammar school, which is one of the best in the country, the Linguistics Grammar School. Had a sound education in the classics, Latin, and a bit of Greek, and a bit of history. And then at 18, he got married, and then went to London. This part's sketchy, but he joined several different theatre companies as a jobbing actor and a patcher up of old plays, and then gradually started to write his own work, and soon became the leading actor and playwright for various companies, including the Queen's Men, it's Queen Elizabeth's own personal acting troupe. And when she died, King James I took over the company, and they became the King's Men. So he was the leading actor and writer for the major theatre company in the country. And not only that, he was a good businessman. He helped to run the company under the Globe Theatre. He was a property developer and a keen businessman. So, you know, quite an extraordinary life, and a short life. He died at 52, prosperous and respected, and kept up his interest in theatre right to the end.
So you do talk about the fact that you have dialogues as a different characters in your book, but with Shakespeare, because he doesn't have, you know, you don't really know where you stand. You see things through his characters. It was difficult to do that with him.
That's right. Yes, yeah. You can't, as I say, you can't really finally declare what he was like. But his contemporaries refer to him as gentle Shakespeare, sweet Mr. Shakespeare. So he was obviously amiable company, not a tearaway like Christopher Marlowe, or a rambunctious troublemaker like Ben Jonson. He was, I think, rather quiet, sat in the background, took notes, listened to people, took it all in, and then wrote it down. He was acting in the daytime and directing. He was writing at night, and was turning out 3 or 4 major plays a year, which is quite astonishing. So hardworking, industrious, and I'd say above all, he was a philosopher and a humanist, in that all his plays, I think, as a body of work, are essays in the 2 most fundamental questions of who we are and what is a good life. And whether it's writing comedy or tragedy or romance or even farces, those questions are examined again and again. And that's why it's, as well as entertaining and highly theatrical, there's a substantial body of thought that we have to keep engaging with.
So, you know, in relation to, you mentioned Christopher Marlowe, and, you know, Marlowe, of course, had written The Jew of Malta, which was particularly successful. And in your book, you say, like Shakespeare, Marlowe was an opportunist with a keen nose for popular subject matter. Can you comment on, you know, will Shakespeare, on the subject matter? I mean, you referred to the Dr. Lopez. Perhaps you could give the listeners, the participants in this Zoom conference, some idea of, you know, what might have led to Marlowe's play and then to The Merchant of Venice.
Well, the Dr. Lopez case was quite notorious. There were not many Jews in London because they'd all been expelled, I think, in 1490 by the first, I think, from memory.
1290.
1290.
Yes.
So there were, of course, a few tolerated, but they were not, certainly not, didn't want to be high profile. You kept your head down. But Dr. Lopez was a Portuguese Jew, and he was employed as Queen Elizabeth's personal physician, which is rather extraordinary. He must have been bloody good at his job. But he got implicated in a court intrigue, and I think he was steamrolled by a certain court faction who accused him of treason and a plot to poison the Queen. It was, one presumes from the evidence, it was totally trumped up as a political move, one rival faction playing up another, but he was found guilty, he was executed. And this created a wave of anti-Semitism, popular, sort of bogeyman kind of nonsensical anti-Semitism that Christopher Marlowe tapped into and wrote this play, The Jew of Malta, which is a travesty, really. It's a black comedy or farce with this horrendous Jewish character called Barabbas, who poisons a whole convent full of nuns and poisons wells and people. that was a very popular hit, of course, which addressed the popular sentiment at the time. And then I think Shakespeare, as a rebuttal of that, wrote The Merchant of Venice, which again has a Jew as its so-called villain, but he turns the tables on the audience by giving the Jew center stage at times, and he can plead his cause and show the reasons of his hatred for the Christians. And this would have been very confronting and controversial. For a long time, of course, the character was played as a kind of a grotesque character, but I think not originally, because Richard Burbage would have played Shylock, and he was the most famous actor in Shakespeare's troupe, and tremendously great tragedian. So I imagine he brought a lot of gravitas to the role. But over the next couple of hundred years, it was seen as a comedy with a farcical sort of comic Jew, and the Christians turned the tables on him. And it's only in more recent times, I think, that scholars and actors and directors have plumbed the depths of the play for its ironies and its relevance and all the ambiguities that Shakespeare deliberately throws into the play to make it confronting and disturbing and controversial, but still.
In Marlowe's play, you have the sort of stereotypical evil Jew, but also the evil black.
Oh, yes, that's right. And of course, The Merchant of Venice addresses that too. It's not just anti-Semitic. In the second scene of the play, Portia, the heroine, and Lady Nerissa discuss all the suitors who have come, and they dismiss the black, the Italian, the Englishman, the German, all being sort of ridiculous characters. So it's really about a white upper-class society, by which Shakespeare means England, of course, who are quite xenophobic and very complacent, and it's everybody else is kept out. It's totally racist and xenophobic society, and that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the England of his time and the bigotries that govern people's behaviour.
So one of the interesting comments that you've made is that, Elizabethan audiences, you said, were expecting Shylock to be a stereotypical villain like Barabbas, but you say that Shakespeare delighted in turning audience expectations on their heads and subverting established models. Could you elaborate a bit on this, please?
Well, I think what we see is the justification for Shylock's behaviour. And so if you like, he sets up a typical comedy. You have the noble, heroic Antonio the merchant, the nasty Jew who wants to kill him, and the witty, glamorous Portia who turns the tables on the Jew and saves the Christian's life. That's what the audience would have been expecting. But if you look at Antonio, he's very difficult to play as a noble, heroic person. He's so virulently anti-Semitic and bigoted and hard-hearted. It's very difficult to play him as the romantic hero. And Portia makes the great speech about mercy, which is a lovely, powerful speech in its own right. Taken out of context, she pleads for mercy and then turns the table on Shylock, strips all his property and condemns him virtually to death. Then the Duke says, well, we'll show you Christian mercy. We'll spare your life, but we'll take all your property away from you. Is it okay with you, Antonio? Antonio says, yes, that's okay with me, as long as he leaves whatever he's got left to his daughter and son-in-law, the daughter who was converted to Christianity and the son-in-law who seduced her. So, they strip Shylock of all he's got, and that's Christian mercy. And that's one of the ironies in the play, I think. They talk about mercy, but what they show is rather the opposite side of that. And Shylock is given the reasons for why he is so enraged and suppressed and violent, in that he's always been mocked and spat on and ridiculed by the Christian society around him. They subvert his business deals, etc. And then a young Christian, Lorenzo, another layabout like Bassanio, seduces his daughter, persuades her to elope, pinch most of her father's money and treasure, and then convert to Christianity. So no wonder Shylock just snaps and goes totally off the rails and demands his pound of flesh. I think if you're playing Shylock, as I've done, you can find eminent justification for what he feels and what he's going to do. Some productions try to soften it. I think the great Jewish actor Jacob Adler said, well, he's only joking, and he winks at the audience, he's not going to really kill Antonio. I think he is. He has to. You've got to follow that through and say that's the state that he's in at that moment of the play. You can't escape that. We know it's a comedy. We know that it's going to end up well, etc. For some people, but none of Shakespeare's comedies end up well for everybody. There are always winners and there are always losers. And in this case, both Shylock and Antonio are the losers.
So do you think then that the bond to take a pound of flesh at the beginning, he might not have intended to carry it through at that point in time? I mean, it seemed likely that Antonio would have been able to repay his debt, but it's really after, you know, the elopement of his daughter, the theft of the property, you know,
the conversion,
you know, selling his wife's deceased wife's ring and so on.
In exchange for the monkey.
Yes, psychologically broken.
Oh yes, I think that's right. He has to be. If you're playing the part, you have to justify why he would get to that stage, that murderous state. And I think one can follow that through. It's not a hard place to get to. If you're playing, he's a proud man. He's a fairly arrogant character, a dominating father figure. You can argue that he's a bad Jew. He doesn't really subscribe to the humanity of Judaism, but he follows its forms, but in fact, he breaks Jewish law.
So, you know, there's been so many different interpretations of Shylock, and he's been presented in various ways on the stage and in film. But, you know, you were talking about when you played Shylock and also when you directed Shylock, when you directed The Merchant, you know, what was your experience of doing so and how did you kind of prepare for the role?
Oh, I took great care to research the role. I read a lot about Jewish history and practice and culture. I went to dinner with various Jewish people and sat around the table and asked them what the experience was like of being in the culture and what they made of the play and what the play was saying. So I did try to immerse myself as much as I could in the culture and understand. Of course, it was rather difficult to get a bead. People would say, well, he's not a good Jew, he's not a very good Jew, he does this, he does that. There's no one answer to what a good Jew is or what practice they should follow. It's quite a controversial statement to make. But so I did try very hard to understand where Shylock is coming from, but then independent of his religious background, what was like for any man to suffer what he has suffered in terms of the ignominy and the insults and then the robbery and the discrimination. Where would you end up? Where would you get to? And I could justify that.
You said that, you know, after, I'm not sure whether it was your performance, but some of your Jewish friends said to you that you were pretty rough on the Christians. Can you comment on that?
Well, I thought I'd gone a bit far, and sort of, but I don't know about that. The Christian behaviour, especially from Antonio, is pretty reprehensible. You think what they do and what they say and how they triumph over Shylock in the end. You see, Shakespeare's audience was a very sophisticated one. They weren't yobbos who chuck vegetables at the actors. That's not. You don't write plays as sophisticated or as complex with that sort of audience. They were very sophisticated, very literate, and they knew what he was doing, taking a certain form and then subverting it, and they would have enjoyed the irony and the defying expectations and the games he was playing with an established model. So that's what I was looking for, to find the irony in the play and the complexities that make it much more than just a romantic comedy of stereotypical character.
So, you know, according to my reading, The Merchant, you know, when a lot of theatre was banned, was particularly popular in Nazi Germany, and you know, from 33 to 39, I'm told there were more than 50 separate productions, but those, of course, were edited with the more sympathetic speeches removed.
Yes.
And, you know, in a number of the productions, apparently there were actually commentators on hand in the theatre to make sure that, you know, the audiences didn't miss any of the implications. And, you know, there have been critics like Harold Bloom, for example, who said that, you know, the play is profoundly anti-Semitic, and that, you know, Shylock is a claim that, you know, as time passed, even though there were very good actors playing the role, people came to understand a little more of the subtleties of it all.
You cannot play Sherlock as a comic villain. You can try, and you can play some bits of it as a comic villain, but you cannot do his major speeches as a comic villain. They are tragic speeches and very insightful. Can I give you a couple?
Please do. Yes, we're at this point. So John has kindly agreed to read a couple of speeches. So, well, do you want to set the context?
Yes, I will. When we first see Sherlock, he is meeting up with Bassanio, who's a wasteful ne'er-do-well who wants to borrow money from his friend Antonio, the rich merchant. And Antonio hasn't got any money at hand because it's all out of being invested, but he says he can back it and he'll have to borrow money from Sherlock, who he hates and despises, but he for Bassanio's sake, and wants to impress Portia, totally materialistic. And the reason he wants to impress Portia is to marry her because she's so rich. He doesn't love her, he doesn't even know her, but he knows that she's a wealthy heiress, and so he wants to make he spots Antonio coming, and even there, the merchants mostly congregate on the interest. So that's what we said. I think, oh, he's the villain. He hates Antonio. He must be the nasty villain. But it gives some little reason for that. But then it becomes more money, but in a very curt. And Sherlock answers him many a time and oft on the regular. Money is of my use. Still have I borne it with a patient. You or me, misbeliever, me, and all for use of that which is mine own. Well then, it now appears the dog money. Is it possible that Kerr can lend 3,000 ducats? Or shall I bend low and in a bondman's key, with bated breath and whispering humbleness, say this, fair sir, you spat on me on Wednesday last, you spurned me such a day, another time you called me dog, and for these courtesies I'll lend you thus much money. Which is very sarcastic and ironic, but he puts it very clearly. How bloody dare you come to me after all you've done and ask me for money? So I think he actually enjoys putting Antonio on the spot. But Antonio's answer is not conciliatory. He says, I must like to call thee so again, and spit on thee again, and spurn thee too. If thou wilt lend this money, lend it not as to thy friends. For when did friendship take a breed of barren metal of his friend? But lend it rather to thine enemy, who if he break, thou mayst with better face exact the penalty. So he challenges him and says, I feel no obligation to you, no gratitude to you. It's a still your business deal, and if I break it, then you've got me. Now, it's set up that, okay, then Sherlock says, well, I'm not going to take interest from you, but just for a gag, just for a joke, let's say that if you fail, I can take a pound of flesh from you. Antonio says, it's obviously, I'll get out of it cheap because I've got so much investment of money coming to me. I can't possibly fail. I can't go wrong. So this is just a joke deal. Yeah. And I think at this stage, Sherlock can't possibly mean it to follow through. How is he to know that Antonio's ventures are all going to go broke and Antonio will need to pay up? The audience might see it coming because this is a comedy and signal. But Sherlock, he can't possibly anticipate that. The reason he does, I don't want to your filthy interest. I don't want to take interest. Just say, "I have a pound of your flesh." It's as a kind of a rebuke and a disdainful joke on Shylock's part. It's a tremendous shock to Shylock when actually Antonio's intentions do fail and he can't pay up. That should come as a huge shock, I think. He's not expecting that.
Mm. So, Shakespeare obviously got the idea of plots of many of his plays from other sources.
Yeah.
I mean, the histories are obvious, and in this case, apparently there was some Italian folk tale about the bond, but it does sort of represent this, anti-Semitic blood libel, essentially. But from a speech like this, how would you differentiate between a character like Shylock and a character like Barabbas in those plays?
Well, I think
insight and intelligence.
Barabbas has no motivation. He's just a nasty Jewish villain, and he does what he does because that's what he is. Whereas Shylock, I think we would see from what he says that he's just a human being with a huge amount of justifiable rage, anger, resentment, and you can see it all. I think that's totally made clear and articulated, and therefore, when he's driven to extremes as he is by the constant abuse he receives, he ends up committing the thing that he does. So it's a far cry from a stock comic villain. It's not that at all. It's a tragic character,
very much a three-dimensional.
Well, yes, and he I think that again and again he justifies it when in court. He's asked why he wants to kill Antonio, why this revenge. He articulates even more clearly. He hath disgraced me and hindered me of 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies. And what's his reason? I'm a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why, revenge. The villainy you teach me, I will execute. It shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. So he's tough, he's hard, but he justifies it totally. I'll give back what I've got. Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, if you like, that kind of thinking, but that's his background, that's what he is.
So, we chatted earlier about this Michael Radford film in which Al Pacino plays Shylock. And, he says that Al Pacino commented that this has to be one of the greatest speeches ever about racism and prejudice. And it apply very broadly.
Oh, yes.
I mean, I think one of the interesting things that Shakespeare has done, and it's followed by many writers, including novelists later, is that the Jew in normally his, but it could be his or her capacity as an outsider, is someone who is able to look on that society and, see its weaknesses and flaws. And I think this is quite brilliantly done in novel, the novel Ivanhoe by Walter Scott, where York is pursued, by this Christian knight, and there's this misguided notion of chivalry, and she really exposes it for the total, emptiness and distorted values that it represents. So, the Jew as outsider and Shylock's a case in point is very well placed to kind of critique what is happening around in society. Would you agree with that?
I would, absolutely. In fact, the thing he's most pointing out is Christian hypocrisy, which I mentioned earlier, that they talk about mercy, but then are very loath to display any. But when he's challenged again in court, that great court scene at the end, they say, "What don't you dread our judgment?" And Charles says, "What judgment shall I dread? Doing no wrong. You have among you many a purchased slave, which, like your asses and your dogs and mules, you use in abject and in slavish parts, because you bought them. Shall I say to you, let them be free, marry them to your heirs? Why should they sweat under burdens? Let their bed be made as soft as yours, and their pallets be with such viands." You will answer, "The slaves are ours." So do I answer you. The pound of flesh is mine, which I demand is mine. It was dearly bought, 'tis mine, and I will have it. If you deny, fie upon your law. There is no force in the decrees of Venice. I stand for judgment. Answer, shall I have it? So, you preach to me about ownership and the rights to things, and yet you don't look at yourselves and your own shortcomings, your own wrongs.
Mm-hmm. So, for some of the participants in this Zoom meeting who might not have read the play recently, could you just explain how it resolves itself, the whole blood and libel thing, and how is caught out by Porsche, which people can follow?
Yeah. Well, again, it's a wonderfully comic irony about the law, I think, in that and pay up is liable for a pound of flesh to be cut from around his heart. And Shylock is going to go ahead and do that. And of course, this deed doesn't allow any drop of blood. So if you shed a drop of blood, then you are guilty of premeditated murder. And if you take even more or less than a single pound, a tittle of a tittle of an ounce more, then you again are liable to charge of murder, plotting against a person's life. And so Shylock's caught out. She cackles with the law, and that's how how he loses the case. I took this to a couple of judges that I know and said, "What do you make of this?" And the first judge said, "Well, she's wrong. She's making a monkey out of the law. You can't do that. She's not even a judge. She's not even a man. She's a fraud." So it's Shakespeare playing with the law. And the other judge said, "No, she's absolutely right, because what the law is for is to protect human life, and you can't allow a murderous litigant to get away with it." So they were in total disagreement about the rights and wrongs. But I think Shakespeare is making a bit of a monkey out of the law by saying that's how you can twist it and make it anything you want.
And of course, there's the reference to, although there's no evidence of whether or not Shylock was even born in Venice, but he certainly could not acquire citizenship being a Jew. So, the notion of the alien as well applies there.
That's right.
You would in your book, you talk about a fascinating production you saw, I think, in Berlin, where it kind of, turned the usual portrayal of Shylock as a separate character on its head. I mean, I remember seeing a production in London where, the famous Jewish actor Anthony Sher played Shylock, and, he was wearing the prayer shawl, the tallis, and I didn't particularly like that production, but he certainly stood out from the rest of the characters. But I think you say that the way in which in this Berlin production it was quite different. Can you?
Yes, it was the production by the Berliner Ensemble, and what was surprising, it was a very tough production and took all the issues on very boldly. But when all the merchants assembled, they were all dressed alike in three-piece suits and Homburg hats and carrying newspapers. And they were supposed to read their newspapers. And then gradually they began to move away from one who was left. You thought, that's the Jew. And the others are just sort of, moving away, isolating him. And he was just an ordinary German businessman like the rest of them. There's nothing about him that distinguished him from them at all. He played like, I'm a German citizen, like the anti-Semitism was all projected onto him from them, which was fascinating. they also played up the racism of the play by having the Prince of Morocco in a black face, like a coon act, very broad, very grotesque. And Lancelot Godber was like an English bother boy, a soccer hooligan in a Union Jack T-shirt, sort of being anti-Semitic. So they were really playing up the racism, the xenophobic anti-Semitism that this society represents. So the final question is the play anti-Semitic, or is it about anti-Semitism? And if the play is anti-Semitic, then it shouldn't be done. But if it's a play about anti-Semitism and racism and xenophobia and exclusiveness and white supremacy, then it should be done. And it should be debated and talked about and directed and produced very carefully and sensitively as to those issues that we're making clear. This is what the play is about. And you can discuss it and argue about it and like or dislike it, but that's what it's about. A lot of good plays you don't have to like very much. You don't have to like Othello or King Lear, but you can't resist the power of what they're saying and showing you.
Well, I mean, you know, Mark Twain, who has so many racist characters in Huck Finn, for example, you know, doesn't mean that he's endorsing their racism.
That's
Quite
right.
the contrary, he's exposing it and, you know, satirizing it. And
Yes.
I think the case can be made that Shakespeare is doing the same thing. He's exposing the xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and, you know, kind of satirizing that.
I think that's exactly what it's about. Yeah.
So you went to Sydney Uni, I think I read somewhere, with you know, who was it, Jermaine Greer, and
Clive James,
Les
Murray,
and all of those.
good people.
I don't know whether you came across Howard Jacobson at that time.
I know the name, but I don't
So yeah.
Didn't
So
cross
well, I mean,
paths.
he did a program. I mean, he's a British Jewish novelist. He wrote a book called My Name is Shylock, but he's you know, he had a Booker Prize-winning novel, the name of which escapes me at the moment. The Finkler Question, I think it was. Anyway, he said he wrote the following within this book that he wrote about Shylock. He said, clearly Shakespeare did not hate Jews. He created a remarkable character in Shylock who is larger than life, so intelligent, amusing, vital, and Shakespeare evokes so much pity for him. The greatest playwright who wrote the incredible speech, "Hath not a Jew eyes," cannot be anti-Jewish. In Shylock, Shakespeare humanizes the foreigner and the alien.
That's very well put.
Yeah.
Better than I can say. Yeah. And I have read My Name is Sherlock. Yes, I've forgotten Harry.
Yeah.
That puts it very well. I totally endorse that.
Yeah, no, it's certainly an interesting read. I mean, you know, I think it's clear that because the play has been sometimes poorly directed and badly taught, it's been the source of much anti-Semitism. But I think it's important that it should be taught and it should be produced, but with some insight and sensitivity.
Great deal of sensitivity. Yeah, it can be so easily distorted, as in Nazi Germany. You cut all those sympathetic speeches out and you play the character grotesquely. I'm sure it was Goebbels' favourite play.
So, John, I believe that you're doing a one-man show, and I'm very interested to hear a bit more about this, and I'm sure our audience would be too. So before we take some questions from the audience, could you tell us a bit about this, please?
Yes, I was supposed to do something for the Bell Shakespeare Company's 30th anniversary this year. I left the company 5 years ago, but they said, would you please come back and do something to celebrate our 30th anniversary? So I concocted a one-man show. It couldn't go on, so I just did 20 minutes of it on the Opera House website. I think you can select House website, if not on the Bell Shakespeare website. I just did 20 minutes of the show it's going to be. But it's basically my reactions to Shakespeare, how he's influenced my thinking, my life, and hopefully some insights into characters like Shylock and other characters by quoting and talking about them. So it's about an 80-minute show all up, just a very personal view of Shakespeare and its impact on me over the last 60 odd years.
So tell us a bit more about how he's influenced your life. Give some of it away. You, you have made some remarks, and it's a huge bit.
Well, I think I find that I would suggest that Shakespeare was agnostic when it came to religion, ideologue, but skeptical and questioning. And I think that's very much the way I am, and I think he's helped me get to that point. And many other people could too, of course. You could read other authors who might get you to the same point, but I found that through Shakespeare and through not being ideological, but trying to find a middle way, and his compassion, his humanity, his tolerance for both society to come down to the heart of the question, who's right, who's wrong, if Caesar, who's right, who's wrong, you'll make mistakes, good leadership, bad leadership. So to life, I think, as well as opening up, awareness of the beauty of language and imagery and the sheer scope of what literature can do. That one writer can go from knockabout farces to profound tragedy and everything in between, and reveal his heart through his writing in a way that I find extremely enriching and a bold thing to do with your life. To be so, make a public confession of who you are, even though you're wearing a mask, you're still talking about the biggest issues in life, and that has made a big impact on me, I think.
I read somewhere that Shakespeare was lucky that he was born when he was, because had it been 50, 80 years before, with the limitations on the theatre, we might not have gained so much from this absolutely unique and incredible mind. And
that's true. And 40 years later, the theatres were all demolished by Oliver Cromwell. So he came at just the right time. The theatre was at its zenith and just beginning to burgeon. And he was one of the people who helped make it what it was.
Now, I understand we do have a number of... So I want to give some scope to people who asked them. So one of the questions is, what are your favourite roles? Your favourites?
I think Richard III is probably my very favourite, because there is a real villain and an unreconstructed one. But again, one can justify Richard's villainy in that if you look at the sequence of plays, Henry VI leading up to Richard III, he again, because he's deformed, has been discriminated and spat on and ridiculed and excommunicated from the mass of society. And he takes out his revenge on society by becoming a monster. And I think you can look at other monsters in modern history who have been, seen themselves as persecuted and are determined to take their revenge on who they see as the other, the enemy. There have been many examples of that. And so I can justify Richard's character and actions through his past behaviour. But he is nevertheless a deliciously amusing and witty and clever manipulator. I'm enjoying playing Hamlet because it's the most profound and interesting role. You can play that every 5 years and find something has happened to you in that time that makes the play different again. I played King Lear a couple of times, and that's a backbreaker. I don't think I'd ever try that one again. It's just so demanding of the actors and the audience. It's a cruel, tremendous tragedy, but bloody hard work.
The insights that Lear gets, following his demise, and issues of sort of justice and poverty and how the other half lives, are really quite profound. And
it's a deconstruction of the patriarchy, the damage the patriarchy causes, and of course an abuse of power. To be that kind of tyrannical overlord, and then to be deprived of all of that and suddenly discover that you're just a poor naked creature like the rest of humanity. It's a tremendous turnaround, and it's the most wonderful play, the most profound of all the plays, I think.
So, I don't know whether you would agree with this, but it's sort of popular belief that, Greek tragedy, the tragic hero generally meets his, fate, but it's a consequence of fate beyond, his control. Whereas in Shakespeare, the tragic hero either, popular belief is due to an error of judgment or a moral flaw. It's, we have free will and that determines their fate. To what extent do you think this is true of the great tragedy?
I think that's true. I think the Greeks, you were smitten by a god or fate because of the gods or fate's vindictiveness. It just dipped you out and destroyed you. And the greater you were, the bigger the downfall. But I think the last line of Oedipus Rex, let no man be called happy until he is in his grave, that, life is a tragic exercise and you can't escape your doom, and the gods are vindictive. Whereas in Shakespeare, no, the universe is godless. Things are accidental, things happen, but really, you do have choices. You make certain choices that have consequences. But even after the direst tragedy, like in Lear, there is still some hope in that there are virtuous characters like Cordelia and Edgar and Kent. There's some honesty, some integrity, something left. It's like springs of fresh green after bushfire. There is some hope in the future, which the Greeks don't have, of course. It's doom all the way.
So there's a question here that we have covered it to some extent, but your comment would be appreciated, and that is, do you think that Shakespeare may ever, the plays might lose their relevance or popularity? Could there come a time?
I don't see that as possible in their content. The language, of course, will keep on changing. So in another 100 years or so, it might be like reading Chaucer today. The language will change so much. So it might need more and more translation, which would be a great pity in some ways, because of the musicality and the imagery. But we wouldn't lose the philosophy, the thoughts, the ideas. The stories would survive in translation. Shakespeare works very well in Russian and Italian and even in various Chinese dialects that is played all over the world. So the plays can mean something in translation. So we may get to that point, but the issues, the fundamental human issues, haven't changed in a long, long time. I don't think they'll change in the very distant future even.
Another question is, are there any Shakespeare works that you don't particularly like?
There are some that I think are not as resonant as others. The early comedy of The Two Gentlemen of Verona is not as clever or as profound as, say, Twelfth Night or As You Like It. A play like Titus Andronicus, which is a blood-soaked melodrama, has the elements of King Lear, but it's nowhere near as great a play. They're all worth doing, but some perhaps less important than others. A play like Troilus and Cressida, which I like very much, is so cynical and black and negative that you wonder why you want to see this. But again, it's an ironic comment on so-called heroism and chivalry that it's well worth examining.
And you said that Lear was so difficult to play, but of the great tragedies, do you have a favourite?
Well, I think Lear is my favourite of the tragedies, in that it's just so wide-ranging, and Lear's deconstruction of society from the top right down to the bottom through all levels of society, and his understanding of human cruelty and ineptitude and ingratitude is so profound. Lear goes through something the other characters don't go through. They're more confined to one person's tragedy, whereas Lear is the tragedy of a whole structure of the whole society.
I've got a question here about how do you feel about making changes to Shakespearean plays in the service of a sort of modern audience's insight or appreciation? For example, gender swapping, and there's a reference to the king and consort in Cymbeline as an example. Do you have any issues with that at all?
gender swapping in Shakespeare goes back a long way. You have to remember that in his own day, all the women's part were played by men. So gender swapping was there from the very start. And throughout the last couple of hundred years, we've had women playing Hamlet and Richard III and characters in Julius Caesar, Mark Antony. It's not a new thing. Women have played these roles, and it does give a fresh insight into the plays. It's got to be done, again, sensitively and for a reason, not just, oh, let's swap everybody around and make the women play men and vice versa, or let's just cast colourblind for the sake of it. That is not very intelligent. If you're going to cast someone of a different cultural background or ethnicity, you've got to make some comment through doing that. Otherwise, it's just a token exercise, the same with gender swapping. But I think you can do anything you like with Shakespeare. There's no law against it. You can cut and paste and rewrite, and if you want to, and make it from making a piece of theatre. And many people have done that. Barry Kosky has done it, I think, brilliantly. But it's Barry Kosky's King Lear rather than Shakespeare's King Lear. That's okay. It's a piece of theatre. But if you are interested in preserving Shakespeare's heritage and keeping it alive, then I think a director and actors have to think, well, what did he mean? What did he want? What is the effect he meant to have? And try to reproduce that. That's what is important to us. And the more you change and cut and paste and throw away, well, the less important it seems to be. You might as well do something else, write a new play.
So what about some of the work that the Bell Company has done, like in, outlying communities and indigenous communities? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Ever since the company was instituted in 1990, I was determined that we'd have an education wing, because that's how I got introduced to Shakespeare, seeing it when I was in a country town. We had no other access to live performance other than touring troupes. So I wanted the Bell Shakespeare Company to have shows on the road all over Australia from the very beginning, playing in schools and playing in regional centres, and that has been the case over the last 30 years now, because I think too much cultural experience is confined to the metropolitan areas, and we need to keep going into the regions, not just because we owe it to them, but because that's where we'll see it, and like me, maybe become inspired to let it affect their lives in a major way.
The question here is, what would you suggest is the most important Shakespeare work to be read or seen by a first-timer or a theatre novice? Any suggestions there? Or any films that, in this time of COVID, although the theatres are opening, are there any great films of Shakespeare plays that you would recommend to people who might be relatively new to Shakespeare?
Well, in recent times, I think Kenneth Branagh's Henry V is a very good piece. Trying to think of other more recent ones. There haven't been all that many in recent times. The BBC did a whole series, and they may be on tap, but they were a bit hit and miss. I found some of those. For a first-time audience, I think perhaps a comedy like A Midsummer Night's Dream, for instance, if done at all well, has a lot of appeal. It's for its poetry and its humour and its fun and its exploration of different universes. Twelfth Night can be a delightful play to see for the first time, but all these things, I say, have to be well done. To see a shoddy one can put you off for life. And I've seen many shoddy productions of Shakespeare. I've probably done a couple myself, but if you don't want to turn people away, it's got to be done with tremendous integrity if you go to, because it is hard. It's hard for actors to articulate all those ideas and make them seem spontaneous and fresh. It's hard for directors and designers to create a universe you can believe in. So it's not an easy run. But I think maybe some of the comedies. Julius Caesar is a very straightforward, simple play to understand. The language is less ornate and less complex, and the issues are very clear. And it's always a relevant play. You have politicians backstabbing each other. It's always news. It's always true.
There have been many different films of Romeo and Juliet, from Franco Zeffirelli to, I think, the Baz Luhrmann. Do you have any favourites or thoughts on any of them?
Having seen a couple of them again recently, I think the Zeffirelli Zeffirelli one stands up the best. I think Bez's film has got a bit dated now. It's, radical in its time, but movies and productions date very quickly as society changes day by day. So I recommend the Zeffirelli version of Romeo and Juliet. I think it still holds up well.
Right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the session. So, John, thank you very much. It really has been a great pleasure and privilege chatting to you, and I'm sure the audience and all the people who subscribe to Dunera would much appreciate. And I understand if people have friends who haven't had the opportunity to view this, there will be an opportunity to see a recording of it. How is that done, Sarita? Can you explain? And I'll say, yeah.
Sure, it goes onto the catch-up section of our website.
So on the catch-up session of the Dunera, so it's dunera.org.au, there will be an opportunity to see this session again. So thank you very much to John.
Thank you
to everyone for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a very nice chat. I enjoyed it too.
Thank you.